Hello, students of ABEC 102. Welcome to our online class today. We have a lot to talk about, including scientific visualization and primary literature. So what is this scientific visualization? Well, when I say that, you probably think about graphs and tables, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. We like to graphically show our data in various ways, and that helps us to convey our information to a variety of audiences. It's really important to be able to do this because, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's true, uh, especially when we're trying to get information across about the studies that we've learned about or the studies that we've done ourselves. And in this lesson, I hope that we will learn some of the rules that go along with scientific visualization. And what do I mean by rules? Well, if you want to tell your best story or convey your information properly, you're going to want to convey it in a way that actually makes sense. For example, this graphic right here is showing that there is about a 5-inch average height difference between women from different countries. And the way in which they display this data is a little bit ridiculous. Um, so you want to be able to follow some of the rules in order to convey that information properly. Let me give you another example. So here are some data from the 2020 presidential election. And you can see as we look between these two different graphs that they're very different, but they're both actually conveying real information. So in this first one, you can see that each of the dots represents the land or the area of a county where voters either voted for the red color, which is representing our Republican candidate, or the blue colorization which represents our Democratic candidate. And each circle is just filling up the county in which those votes were placed. But if we look at the next graphic, you can see that instead of just representing the county, we're now looking at the number of people or the population size of that county as represented by the size of the circle. Both maps actually show the same realistic data set, real data set, but they're just displaying the information differently. So the story that you tell with your data and how you choose to tell that story is just as important as the data itself. So there are some rules that we follow when we're trying to show our information that helps us to be more honest and present our data in a way that is going to convey the information that we want it to. So one of the first things that we need to consider when we are making our graphs and our tables and our scientific graphics is the data itself. So the design of your experiment, the variables that are included within your hypothesis, and the analysis of your data are all really important. So we're going to discuss different aspects of studies throughout the semester and better understand how those all contribute to the way in which we will present our science. But we'll start with the data itself right now. So you'll learn as you get into statistics classes, or maybe you already have talked about it if you've taken a stats class before, that there are different types of data. We can very generally break up data in and categorize it as either qualitative or quantitative data. So think about those two terms for a second. Qualitative refers to the qualities of something, and quantitative refers to quantities or numbers. So if you think about those terms, looking at the different types of data sort of makes a little bit more sense. So there are two types of qualitative data. The first is called nominal. Nominal usually refers to like a name or a category that some sort of data set belongs to. So for example, Democratic versus Republican, those are categories or names. Those would be qualitative data points. Colors, red, green, blue, purple, those are categories. different types of animals, mammals versus reptiles versus birds. Those would be nominal data. Another type of qualitative data is very similar to that, but we refer to it as ordinal data because there's some sort of ranking within those categories. So if you think about freshmen versus sophomores versus juniors versus seniors, right? Those are all categories, but there's an order to them. There's something intrinsic about them that puts one above or below the other category. So those are two types of qualitative data that we'll be dealing with. And there are two types of quantitative data that we deal with too: interval data and ratio data. Now, these are very similar to each other. And in this class, we don't necessarily differentiate between the two. We most often think about quantitative data as ratio data, and ratio data has true zero. So something like the amount of time it takes to do something, or I suppose a score on a test, right? If you don't take the test, that's a zero. But quantitative really, both categories of quantitative data really refer to data that have a quantity associated with them. And so why am I talking about these different types of data and how to categorize data? Well, these types of data actually can help us to understand how best to graph our specific data that we've collected. Our data helps us to determine which type of graph that we are going to make. The most basic of all graphing rules is that we plot the independent and dependent variables on two different axes. So if you've made graphs before, you might know that the axis of the graph that kind of goes up and down is referred to as the y-axis, shown in this example in red. And the y-axis is the dependent variable. This is what we think is affected by our second variable, which is our independent variable. And our independent variable is usually found on the x-axis. And if you look in this picture, you can see the x-axis is shown in purple, and it's horizontal along the bottom of our slide. And we think that this independent variable is what causes the change in the dependent variable. So we'll talk a lot in this class about our independent and dependent variables and how we're going to actually put those within our graphing scientific visualizations. So if we're thinking about our variables, we can also think about those categories of data that I just described, qualitative versus quantitative, and that helps us determine the type of graph we're going to make. Are we going to make a bar graph, or are we going to make a line graph? Are we going to make a pie chart, or are we going to make a scatter plot? These are sort of our four basic types of graphs that we make. There's others we'll look at, but these are your basic types of graphs. Now, if your independent variable is qualitative, so it's broken up into categories, then we typically will either make a pie chart or a bar graph, depending on the type of data that our dependent variable is. If our dependent variable is also qualitative, then we will make it into a pie chart. And if it's quantitative, then we will make a bar graph. If our independent variable is quantitative, though, so if it's one of those ratio or scale type data, if there's numbers associated with it rather than categories, then we typically will make a scatter plot or a line graph. And so we're going to consider different data sets within ABEC 102 and try to determine which types of graphs we're going to use. There are other things we have to consider, though, other rules, like I said, for making the best graphs that we can to tell our best story. Some of those that we'll discuss throughout the semester include knowing your audience. Who are you making this graph for? Is it for a graph lover like me or like the other ABEC professors? Or is it for graph haters, people who don't want to have a whole lot of data in front of them all at once? So you have to consider that and you might have to break up your data into smaller bite-sized pieces, or you might be able to put all your data onto one graph. It really depends on who your audience is. You also want to make sure that you're using color appropriately. Colors do mean things. When we looked at the data about the election results, typically Democrats are blue and Republicans are red. This is a system that's been used in our country for many decades now. And so we automatically associate those colors with the different political parties. They don't really mean anything, but we've assigned meaning to those colors. So think about that when you are choosing the colors to put into your graphs. If color isn't necessary, you can always keep it black and white, right? You're just trying to get that information out there. As we use different programs to make graphs, I do urge you to not just use the program default, right? What they automatically give you. They'll probably give you two bars or two lines. One is blue and one in red. That's rarely the best way to tell your story. So you're going to want to adjust your graph based on the information that you want to convey to the folks that you're making your graph for. You want to always be honest and give the true story. Don't leave any of your data out. Don't mislead the reader, and make your data look like there's differences there when there aren't. And you want to avoid chart junk. So, don't put in anything too fancy in there, or too distracting. Basically, I like to live by the rule that I don't make my graphs extra. Now, when we meet in person the next time, we're going to actually do an activity together and we're going to collect some data. And we're going to work together to graph that data appropriately. So we're going to talk about which type of data we've collected, right? Is it qualitative or quantitative data? And then we're going to decide what type of graph we should make. Now, here in ABEC 102, we're going to do a lot of activities in which we're collecting data, and we're going to have many opportunities to make graphs. We are pretty much going to stick with using Google Sheets. So if you're not familiar with Google Sheets, you might want to take a minute today to click on it and just sort of check it out. It's a spreadsheet. It's very similar to Excel if you've used Excel in the past. And it has a lot of similar features, but it's a little bit different. And all of you should be able to sign into Google Sheets with your Canisius email so that you'll be able to save all of the different graphs and data sets that you're making here in ABEC 102. So look forward to this in our next class. Together, we'll work on making some graphs in Google Sheets, and throughout the semester here in ABEC 102, we'll have a lot of opportunities to learn more about the functions of this program. Another thing that we are going to be working on a lot in ABEC 102 is reading scientific papers. So within our field, we look a lot to what we call the primary literature to understand more about how animals behave in relation to their environment. And we're going to spend a lot of time reading these scientific articles. Now, if you've read scientific articles in the past, I want you to pause and think for a second. When you think about reading these scientific articles, how do you feel? Are you comfortable reading scientific articles? Or when you read them, are you just trying to make it out alive? I'm sure within your life, you've read some popular articles about animals and behavioral ecology. I mean, let's be honest, we all love animals. And I know I spend some time reading tweets or whatever we call them now that it's X, or different reels or different TikToks about cool animals doing fun things, or read those little clickbait stories about, whales that have found friends in the ocean. These are typically popular articles, or now videos. that are not really written for the scientific community. They may have taken information from the scientific community and then they're conveying it to a more popular audience. And these aren't really the types of articles that we're talking about in this class. In this class, we want to look to the scientific literature that's actually written by scientists. These can include reports and books, textbooks, or books that are written on specific topics. These can include theses and dissertations, which are usually a culminating project for a master's or a PhD student. But really, we're looking the most in this class at peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, I've talked about peer-reviewed scientific articles for about 5 minutes now. So let's define what they really are. When we say peer-reviewed scientific articles, what we're referring to are articles that are refereed or scholarly. They are called the primary literature because they are research articles that are written by experts and are reviewed by other experts in the field and then published in a journal. And when this process takes place, we are confident in the information that's found within those articles because they were written by the primary author, so the person who actually did the experiment or made the observations themselves, and they are reviewed by other scientists who are also in the field, who are also going to check for the validity of what is in those articles. And so these are the most trustworthy types of science articles to read because they literally are coming from the scientists and from the scientists in the field. And so we should trust them. Not everything in a journal is peer-reviewed or primary literature. So sometimes if you look at scientific journals like behavioral ecology, there are letters to the editor, reviews that are all very informative, but are not necessarily research articles. So we are going to spend some time in ABEC 102 looking at a lot of these research articles. We thought it would be important to tell you a little bit about sort of this peer review process that I just mentioned. So this graphic gives us an idea about what goes on. So it starts out with scientists doing a study. We're going to talk about behavioral ecologists specifically and about how they design their studies in order to understand how animals interact with their environment. But once they've finished that study and they find out something really interesting, they'll write about it. So, for example, I study zebrafish, and I have done some studies where I've learned that males and females make different social choices. So they make different decisions about who they want to hang out with. So I think that's really interesting and cool. And so I'm going to sit down at my computer and I'm going to write about it. And then I'm not just going to publish it. That's not how it works. I don't just like post it on my blog, although that would be fun. But instead, I send it to a scientific journal. And the scientific journal has an editor who will read over my article, and then he or she will decide to send it out to other scientists in my field, my peers. So the peers are going to review that article. It's kind of like when you write a paper and you give it to your teacher and your teacher looks it over. That's what they're doing. They're going to look it over. They're going to see if, I presented the information properly. They're going to determine if I did the proper statistics, if I made my graphs properly, right? Am I visualizing? Am I following all those rules we just went over about scientific visualization? And then they're going to make a whole lot of comments on it. They're going to get their red pens out and they're going to write all over it. And then they're going to send it back to the editor. And then the editor is going to send it back to me. And I'm going to look at all of those suggestions that the peers of mine made, and I'm going to improve my paper. And then I'm going to send it back to the editor, who then might send it back to some more peers to look it over again. And this process can happen over many, many months, or unfortunately, many years. So this can take a long time. It's also possible that if the study is not considered appropriate, if there was some misleading information or maybe the study design wasn't good, it's also possible that the article would not be published because it would not meet the standards that the journal has. But once it does, if it does, it will be published, and that's when we get our scientific journals, our primary literature within those journals that we read. So that's what we're going to focus on here in ABEC 102, some of those research papers that have been published in the field of behavioral ecology. Now, if you're familiar with research papers, you know that they all follow the same basic structure. If you've ever written a lab report, you've probably followed the same basic structure too. We tend to find that the papers start with an abstract and then they go into the introduction, then there's the methods and materials, then we go through the results that were obtained within the study, and then a discussion of what those results were. And at the end, there are all the references that the scientists used while writing their papers. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I read a research paper, I do not read them in order. I don't just start at the abstract and read all the way through the references. It would take a long time for me to read all the papers I want to read if I just read them from the very, very beginning to the very, very end. So when I actually read papers, I go a little bit out of order, and I suggest that maybe you might want to do the same. So I always start with the abstract because if you know about abstracts, you know that they are a general overview, right? They're like the tweet version of the paper, except longer, but they're the short version of the paper. And so they give you an idea of what the scientists did, what the main study was, what the hypothesis was, and what are the big findings that they found. So that's a really good place to start to just get a general idea. I then, if I'm interested in it, move on to the results. Yes, that is right. I skip over the introduction and I look right at the results because I want to see the figures. The figures to me, as I started this lecture today with, them are the most important part of the story, right? They identify the variables of the study. And even if I haven't read the methods and materials, the figures are actually going to give me a clue as to how the study was done because I'll very easily be able to identify the independent and dependent variables. After I've looked over the results, I tend to go to the method so they can understand this process of data collection. And then I will read over the introduction very quickly. I usually look at the last paragraph or two because that's where they're really focused on this study. Usually the first couple paragraphs will put the study into context. So if it's something you're really interested in, it's great to read the entire introduction to get some background information. But if you're in a rush because your project's due or you don't have time to read the entire paper, looking at the last few paragraphs will give you an idea about what was happening within this specific study. I'll then look to the discussion so that I can understand the main findings that were found, right, that I saw within my results. And then to be honest, I don't really read the references. I'm sure none of you read through the references either, unless I'm looking for another paper that I want to read that relates to this one. All right, so keeping all that in mind, we would like you to start reading through scientific papers critically the way that we do. And so we've provided for you a basic article summary outline that we hope will help you to just quickly get an idea of what the paper is about and take that information and summarize it in a concise way. And so you'll see posted on D2L, there's an article summary that's blank. And within that, there are these 6 sections. There's a place for you to put the citation of the paper. There's a place for you to state the hypothesis, and we'll talk a little bit about null hypotheses and alternative hypotheses. There's a place for you to quickly summarize what's going on in the methods. You don't have to give every detail, but think about different ways in which the data were collected. And within our class, we're going to learn about the standard ways in which behavioral ecology studies are done. So some of the sampling techniques and the recording techniques, and you'll want to look through the methods and describe those in just a tiny bit of detail. You'll then want to move on to the results and present the main findings. So look at figure 1, figure 2, and what was compared? What were the variables? Did the, independent variable affect the dependent variable? You'll find that within those graphs. Then look to the discussion for the broader importance about why this is interesting. And then there's always a spot for you to make your own personal notes about the article summary. Let's look first at citations. We're going to go through a lot of papers. And when you start reading a lot of papers, now that you are within this field, sometimes you're going to forget which paper said what. And so having the citation for each paper written down is really important so that you can keep track of the papers that you've read and so that you can find those papers again in the future. The citation follows a specific format. There are lots of different formats. You may have used these in some of your other classes. For example, in English, they often use MLA or Chicago style. Within the field of behavioral ecology, we typically use APA formatting, which is the American Psychological Association's formatting, or we use a format that's pretty similar to that. So what you're going to want to do is look on the first page of your scientific article. And within this first page, you're going to find all of the information that you need for your citation. Now here in this article that I put up, if you look in the center of this page, you can see the citation right there. It includes information about the authors, the title, the journal that it was published in, the year that it was published in, the volume that it was published in, and the page numbers. Nowadays, there are mostly online journals. And so many of them will not have long page numbers, but will instead have an article number. And that's what you see represented in this one, as well as the DOI number. Okay, so what are all these things that I was just talking about? This slide shows us the basic APA formatting rules. You can see that in order to properly format your citation, you're going to have to start out with the author's surnames and initial, followed by the year in parentheses, followed by the article title, followed by the journal title, followed by that volume number, and then the page numbers and the DOI. You can see here that I wrote out the citation for the previous slide, the article that we were looking at. The title of that paper was Comparing Data Collection Tools for Zoo Management Decision Making, a case study examining behavioral measures of Humboldt penguin bond strength. And it was written by Galante J. and Margulis S.W., and it was published in the year 2022. So you can see all that reflected right here within our citation. The journal that it was published in is called Animals, and the volume number was 12, the issue number was 21, and the page numbers, or like I said, in this case, the article number was 3031. And then I've copied the link to the DOI here. We want you to practice this. And so for homework, you'll see, as I'll explain in a second, that there is an article that you should look at and you should find the citation for and record that within your article summary. The next part of the article summary that's important to think about is actually reading the paper and trying to determine what the scientists were looking at or examining or studying within that paper. We do this by looking for the hypothesis that was tested. In both observational and experimental studies, there's typically a hypothesis. Now, the most standard way to phrase hypotheses that you see most often is referred to as the alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis implies that there is an effect of the dependent variable on the independent variable. But technically speaking, when we look at data, and we examine it using a statistical test, we really are testing the null hypothesis. So using the null hypothesis allows us to sort of be more precise and to not really have a biased outlook on what we think this study result will be. And so it's good to get into the habit of reporting the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis always basically says that there is no difference or no effect or no influence of one variable on the other. This can be quickly stated as the dependent variable is not affected by the independent variable, or you could say the independent variable has no effect on the dependent variable. You can always just look at a study and plug in those variables into those underlined spots, and that will allow you to state the null hypothesis. Now, I will warn you, most scientists don't state the null hypothesis in their papers. So it's going to be up to you to find this. Okay, so in order to do this, we have to think about what are independent and dependent variables. Now, what I want you to do, I guess for homework, is to look up a definition for independent variable and look up a definition for dependent variable. And I want you to write those in your notes, and I want you to think about what those mean. And then I want you to do some practice. So you can pause this video, leave this up on your screen, and think about these questions at the bottom. So here's an idea. Certain antioxidants in food might benefit the health of animals, such as dogs and people. So some scientists did a study where they had some dogs in a sample that received a daily blueberry supplement high in antioxidants. Others did not. 2 months later, all dogs in the sample were given a health assessment. I want you to try and answer these questions. What was the independent variable of this study? What was the dependent variable of this study? What is the null hypothesis? Looking at those independent and dependent variables. And what is the alternative hypothesis? Write these in your notes, and we're going to talk about them in class next week.